Hi there, this is a video accompanying the Joomla tutorial series developing an MVC component, and in this step we're looking at adding a batch process. Now what I'm planning to do is really just walk through this diagram which is on the tutorial page and really expand on it as we actually do the operations on our Hello World instance. So here's our Hello World's view. And what I've done is I've selected the Spanish greetings that I've got here. And what I'm going to do also is put the debug tools on. I'm going to refresh that just so the debug tools can see it. And here I'm going to click these items, and I'm going to click in a moment this batch button. But just before I click it, we'll just have a look at it in Inspector. And you can see down here, here's our button. We see it's got data toggle equals modal, so it's going to generate a modal whenever it's clicked. And the key thing is this jQuery statement, and jQuery is going to find the element which is an ID of collapse modal and execute this modal show method on it. So what we'll expect to find then when we click it is that if we go into here and look for here, we find that indeed this modal has got collapse modal as the ID. And this really goes back to our code where if we look through our button, here is our button being added, and it's added through including a layout, which is one of the standard Joomla layouts, and that is the one that actually puts the collapse modal onto the button. And here in our layout is the modal, and here we've got collapse modal, which is we need to set as the ID there to really tie this to the batch button that Joomla has output. A couple other things that we're loading here. We're loading a batch footer there and a batch body, and these are specified in these other layout files which are just below. So in our batch body file we've got a number of elements that we're including, and these match these various items here within the modal. So over in the top left we've got this functionality which allows us to select a category and then either move all of the records we've selected to that category, so we're basically changing the category, or we copy each of those records and set this as the category on those new records. And that functionality is related to this line here in our code. Here is our own custom stuff, which just clear that is here on the bottom left. And over on the right hand side we've got set language, set access level and add tag, which relates to these three lines down here. And these are really just standard Joomla library functions. So if we have a component like this, there's a lot of stuff here that we can actually get without any real effort at all. Now if we look at our own here, this is actually output by our layout here, and we've defined our own layout here, and if we specify it like that, Joomla will look in our own layouts file, and here is our layout for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the location of those records, and I'm just going to change it to 40.5 minus 3.8. 40.5 and minus 3.8. And I'm going to leave these items here, and I'm just going to click process. And what we'll see is that will initiate a post up to the server. Here's our HTTP post. And if we look at our params, down here we can see the params that are sent up in that post. Note we've got task equals hello world batch. So when that comes into the server, it's going to be looking for a method batch in the hello world.php controller in our controller subdirectory. Here are the IDs of the records that we have actually selected. And down here is the set of parameters which are related to that batch modal. So here's the category stuff. Notice we haven't selected any category. This can be either C or M, depending whether it's move or copy. But what we've set is our batch position variables here. Here's the language access and tag again, which we haven't set. But what we want to end up with is that batch position set of variables being sent up to the server so that it can be processed. And the batch position is defined in our little layout. Here it is here. So when we specify the name of the HTML input element, that is what gets sent up to the server. So you can see that there. So looking at the diagram, we've kind of covered this is the batch modal, and when we send up the post, we get the IDs which we've selected. We get whatever we put into these XXX and YYY fields, and we set task equals hello world.batch, and that will go up to our server, where Joomla will then look at the task and seek to find an hello world controller and a batch within it. So that is the next thing that we need to set. So in our batch, we are overriding the kind of standard library functionality there, and what we're just setting is the model to use, and we're setting the redirect back to the same form so that whenever we actually complete it, we actually get this form back again. And then we call the parent batch method, which kind of runs the standard library batch method. And that standard batch method is going to get the params from the post, and it's going to call our model batch. And this is where also we have an overriding of the standard functionality, because in our model, we are going to be setting up this property here to include what we have in our functionality here. Now, if we take a look at the code for that, which I have over here somewhere, this is our admin model, or JModel admin in the old naming convention. And if we look at function batch, this is the functionality which is actually run when we call that method in the model. That is, when we call this parent batch here, we're looking at this functionality here. And you could see at the start, it's covering stuff which is associated with the copy and move of the categories. And it needs to do that first because whenever we want to copy categories, the subsequent changes that we make, for example, if we set the position, that position will be set on the new records, the records that have actually been created as a result of the copy process. So we need to process those new records and then actually run them through our position code. We actually create the records and then apply those other changes like language and everything like that to the new records. But if we go back to our code, after it's done that, it's running through this batch commands property here, and this batch commands property is this here. And the way it's working is that it's looking for batch elements coming up in the post which have these keys, and it's saying for those cases this is the method to run. So whenever we look at our parameters that are going up here, we can see these are the keys of the batch array: language ID, asset group ID, tag. And if we look at the code, asset group ID, language and tag. And basically what the functionality does is it looks through the parameters that have come up in the post. If it gets a match with this, it will then call this function here and pass the parameters to that. So what we want to do for our own case, where we've got a batch functionality relating to set the position, is really add another element into this array. We want to add an element which has a key of what we are setting in our post parameters, which is position. And we want it to run a method called batch position, which is what we have down here. So in our batch, when we override this batch method, that is basically what we're doing. We're looking at that batch commands array, and we're creating updating it so that it's a combination, a merging of the existing elements in that array plus the ones that we've defined here. And the ones that we've defined is this here. So after our batch, this line here in our code, the batch commands array in this variable here will have a new element in it. So when we call our return batch of this, our parent batch, it's going to have an extra element to go through. So whenever it goes through that code down here to process those, it's going to call our batch position. And if we look at our batch position, what's it's doing? Well, it's really going through these elements and first of all checking that the user can actually do that operation, and then setting various values based on the parameters that have come in. And what I've done here in the code is I've just actually changed the code so that it outputs the parameters that we receive in batch position. So in our code we've got 3 parameters, which are the value, PKs and the contexts. And the PKs, if we look at them first, that's these. So the PKs are really the array of IDs that we originally set on we originally selected from our ticking of the check boxes. So those have come through. Bear in mind that if we'd originally set to copy the category, copy these records to a new category, then those copied records, the new records, would have different IDs, and the IDs that we would get in our parameter would be the IDs of the new records as a result of the copy, not the original records. The value then we can see up here is really the values that we have set into those input elements in the modal. And you can see there, those were the values that I set in to change the position and set it to latitude 40.5 and longitude minus 3.8. And the third parameter, this context, and this is the sort of thing it contains here. And it doesn't really contain any more information because we've got this ID here up here. But what it does do is it gives us a nice format that we can very simply just call this check user authorize core.edit on that. So in our hello world component, when we did our ACLs, we allowed there to be individual authorizations or different permissions on each element, on each record. So whenever we go through this batch, for each of the IDs, we need to check, can this user perform this operation on this particular record? And if you remember, those permissions were held in the asset table. And if we just do a look at the asset table and wait for it to load, and we go down here, you can see here the sort of thing that we're talking about. com hello world, and then the ID, which really closely matches what we get down here. So I say that I think the reason for that is just that it enables the components to easily have a mechanism to check the authorization. So I think that's really covered most of the stuff on this little diagram. As I said, we've added in the new element for our method and for our parameter, and then that results in it getting run. And what we're doing is we're updating for each record those positional parameters, and as you can see, whenever we look at this view again, all of those have been updated. And if we check, this is Ola as it was previously. If we click on it again, we can now see that it's positioned differently. And similarly, if we look at the other items which are there, we can see that they're similarly positioned. So that's the main functionality. Just a couple of things though to be aware of. The first thing is, well, we've already covered, is this authorize, because we need to check each item individually. The second thing is we've got a list through of PKs here. Rather than processing each record individually, it would be possible to just create a SQL statement which says set the latitude and longitude, where the ID is in this set of IDs that we've been passed here. However, if we did that, we kind of bypass this table store. And if we bypass that table store, remember we're bypassing the observer functionality which is associated with that table store, which is associated with creating tags and creating content history. So one of the reasons for actually doing it this way, applying it individually, as well as the authorized stuff, is so that it actually uses that table store functionality, and in particular the observer on it, to create the content history. The third thing is, whenever we look at these records here, if someone has actually got this open somewhere else, we can still click this here and we'll see a little padlock symbol to say that somebody else is editing it. And the way that the code is written here in this tutorial, it will just go ahead and change those elements. Now, that does mean that whenever the person who is currently writing or editing that record, whenever he saves that record, the R change will get overwritten. So you need to be aware of that and consider for your component how you might want to handle that case. You may just say, well, the admin shouldn't actually click on any record that has a padlock symbol. Or you might want to change the checked out user so that whenever that user tries to check the record back in again, he'll get an error, but that does cause problems by itself. So you just need to think about how you want to exactly handle that situation. The final thing is that these records here, whenever we included our levels in a past tutorial step, adding levels, remember we set it up like this, and remember we had this nested set model. Unfortunately, the Joomla code doesn't work exactly as it should do, and what I'm going to do is just install the kind of the code as it's written in the tutorial, and then I'll show you just exactly what I mean by that. Okay, that's installed. So what I want to do is set this one hasta luego, and I'm going to call the batch, and I'm going to set it just to New Zealand English. I'm going to select a copy, let's say just it's New Zealand English, and process it. And if we then look for New Zealand English, we see that record there. And this is the new record that's been created as part of that process of copying the records. However, if we look at this in phpMyAdmin, and we go down to the bottom, and in particular looking at these two fields here and here, which refer to the parent and the level, you can see that it's really not properly set there. The parent, there should be only one record with a parent of 0 and a level of 0. Now when we go into the Hello World administration and click on that and set it to be published and save and close, and do a refresh on our phpMyAdmin, then we do see that it is actually fixed up. However, if you want to fix that so that it works properly, the way that I did it was to overwrite the I'm not sure whether it's in here or not. Overwrite the batch copy. I don't think it's there. So what I'll do is I'll find it somewhere here. And here what I've done is overridden batch copy And if you go down there, you can see there's a section where it says to do, deal with ordering. So I think they recognize that there's some issue there. And I've just set the positioning elements associated with the new record so that it's positioned correctly. And then when you try doing that and actually creating new records using that copy mechanism, you should find that it actually sets those fields correctly. Okay, that's about it for this step. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.